What truly makes a nation just? Is it merely the protection of individual freedom, or is it a grander blueprint for collective welfare? Welcome to our deep dive into the foundational philosophy of Indian governance. Today, we are decoding Part A of the Indian Constitution, the Directive Principles of State Policy, spanning Articles 36 to 51. Often called the soul of the Constitution, these principles serve as the ultimate moral and administrative compass for the nation. Enshrined right after fundamental rights, the Directive Principles, or DPSPs, present a fascinating constitutional paradox. On one hand, Article 37 explicitly declares that these principles are fundamental in the governance of the country, making it the moral and constitutional duty of the state to apply them when crafting laws. But here is the twist: they are strictly non-justiciable. This means they cannot be enforced by any court of law. If the government fails to implement a directive, a citizen cannot sue the state. They are constitutional recommendations designed to guide executive and legislative action, relying on political accountability rather than judicial coercion. Why construct such a paradox? The answer lies in the grand transition of our national identity. The ultimate objective of the Directive Principles is to systematically engineer a true welfare state, actively transforming India from a colonial police state, focused strictly on maintaining internal law and order, into a modern, equitable society. Think of the Constitution as a bridge built to carry the nation forward. On one side, Part 3 establishes our fundamental rights, securing a political democracy by acting as a protective shield for individual citizens against state overreach. But political freedom is incomplete without social equality. That is why the bridge extends into Part A, where the Directive Principles establish a social and economic democracy, compelling the state to move beyond mere governance and actively secure justice, equality, and robust welfare systems for the marginalized. Now, if you open the official text of the Constitution, you will notice that it does not explicitly classify these directives. However, to understand their structural layout, legal scholars and historians universally categorize the DPSPs into three distinct philosophical pillars that reflect the diverse ideological influences on the Constituent Assembly. Imagine the Indian welfare state as a massive structural platform resting firmly upon these three distinct columns, each representing a unique school of thought. The first is the pillar of Socialist principles, which focuses on engineering economic justice by actively combating structural inequality, preventing the centralization of wealth, and securing a fair distribution of resources. The second column represents the Gandhian principles, a vision dedicated to reconstructing India from the grassroots up through village-level empowerment, the promotion of cottage industries, the establishment of cooperative societies, and a deep commitment to social upliftment and public health. The third and final column stands for the liberal intellectual principles, which map out the pathways to modernize the state, securing progressive governance models like a uniform civil code, early childhood care, environmental protection, and a steadfast commitment to international peace. Together, these three ideological pillars form the complete architectural foundation that shapes every piece of state policy. Let's examine the first philosophical pillar, socialist principles. At the absolute core sits Article 38, commanding the state to secure a social order that actively minimizes inequalities in income, status, and opportunity. Branching out from this core, Article 39 mandates the equitable distribution of community resources, the prevention of concentrated wealth, and guarantees the foundational right of equal pay for equal work. To ensure that the legal system doesn't leave the poor behind, Article 39A guarantees equal justice and free legal aid to those in need. Moving to socio-economic welfare, Article 41 safeguards the citizen's safety net by offering the right to work, education, and public assistance during times of unemployment, old age, or sickness. Finally, Articles 42 and 43 demand just and humane working conditions, maternity relief, and the securing of a living wage for all workers, while Article 43A pushes this industrial democratization further by ensuring worker participation in the management of undertakings. The second structural pillar brings us directly to the grassroots, the Gandhian principles, which intentionally place the traditional Indian village at the very heart of developmental policy. For economic self-reliance, Article 43 commands the state to aggressively promote rural cottage industries, while Article 43b mandates the advancement of voluntary, autonomous, and professional cooperative societies. Moving to social upliftment and protection, Article 46 dictates specialized educational and economic assistance to safeguard scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other weaker sections from exploitation and social injustice. Finally, when safeguarding public health and the agrarian economy, Article 47 targets social well-being by enforcing the prohibition of intoxicating drinks and health-harming drugs, while Article 48 comprehensively organizes scientific agriculture and animal husbandry, placing a strict prohibition on the slaughter of cows, calves, and other milch or draft cattle. Transitioning into the third philosophical pillar, we explore the pathway to modernizing the nation through the liberal intellectual principles. This forward-looking framework begins with the deeply debated Article 44, which directs the state to secure a uniform civil code for all citizens across the territory of India. Moving to the foundation of human capital, Article 45 addresses early childhood care and mandates education for all children until they complete the age of 6 years. Environmental sustainability is hard-coded into the blueprint via Article 48A, commanding the state to protect and improve the environment while actively safeguarding the country's forests and wildlife. For historic preservation, Article 49 places a strict obligation on the state to protect monuments, places, and objects of artistic or historic interest declared to be of national importance. Structurally, Article 50 acts as a crucial guardian of liberty by mandating the separation of the judiciary from the executive in the public services of the state. Finally, anchoring India's global vision, Article 51 outlines the framework for international peace and security, directing the nation to maintain just and honorable relations, foster respect for international law, and encourage the settlement of international disputes by arbitration. As India evolved, so did its constitutional blueprint, with Parliament actively updating Part F through 4 major amendments to address changing socio-economic realities. The first major intervention occurred with the 42nd Amendment of 1976, which introduced a wave of Socialist additions by inserting Article 39A to guarantee free legal aid, Article 43A to ensure worker participation in management, and Article 48A to mandate environmental protection. This was swiftly followed by the 44th Amendment of 1978, which strengthened the state's inequality checks by modifying Article 38, explicitly ordering the government to minimize disparities in income, status, facilities, and opportunities among individuals and groups. Decades later, a monumental structural shift took place via the 86th Amendment of 2002. This amendment elevated elementary education to a fundamental right under Article 21A, which fundamentally altered Article 45 to focus its directive strictly on early childhood care and education for children under the age of 6. Finally, the 97th Amendment of 2011 delivered a decisive cooperative push to the framework, inserting Article 43B to formally establish the promotion of voluntary, autonomous, and democratic cooperative societies as a core constitutional directive for the nation. Because implementing these directives fundamentally requires proactive state intervention, targeted resource redistribution, and sweeping social regulation, Part F inevitably collided with the absolute protection of individual fundamental rights. This sparked a classic constitutional battleground, the rights of the individual versus the welfare of the collective. When the state curtails an individual's personal right, such as the right to liberty or property, in order to achieve a broader, collective socio-economic directive, which part of the Constitution is supreme? This exact high-stakes question triggered a definitive, decades-long power struggle between the legislative intent of Parliament and the judicial oversight of the Supreme Court, fundamentally shaping the evolution of Indian democracy. To truly appreciate why this friction occurs, let us run a quick diagnostic matrix comparing these two structural pillars side by side. Fundamentally, fundamental rights are negative in nature because they explicitly prohibit the state from doing certain things that infringe upon individual freedom, whereas directive principles are positive because they actively require the state to perform specific welfare duties. In terms of enforceability, Part 3 is completely justiciable and legally binding through the courts, while Part F remains entirely non-justiciable and cannot be enforced by any judicial body. Ultimately, while fundamental rights are individualistic, aiming to establish political democracy by protecting the single citizen, the directive principles are communitarian, aiming for social and economic democracy by promoting the welfare of the entire society. This structural difference caused the pendulum of legal supremacy to swing wildly over the years, triggering an intense chess match between the judiciary and parliament. In the very first landmark battle, the 1951 State of Madras v. Champakam Dorairajan case, the Supreme Court held a rigid line, ruling that fundamental rights strictly prevail in that the directive principles must run subordinate as a subsidiary to Part 3. The pendulum began to shift slightly in 1958 with the Kerala Education Bill, where the court introduced the Doctrine of Harmonious Construction, urging judges to interpret both parts together rather than ignoring Part IV entirely, even though formal supremacy stayed with individual rights. However, by the late 1960 and early 1970, the friction reached a boiling point, following the Golaknath ruling which declared that Parliament could not amend fundamental rights. Parliament retaliated by passing the 24th and 25th constitutional amendments, inserting Article 31C to aggressively give specific socialist directive principles absolute primacy over individual rights to equality and property. The conflict reached a boiling point during a historic crisis of power. In the famous 1973 Kesavananda Bharati case, the Supreme Court cautiously upheld the first part of Article 31C, allowing socialist Articles 39B and C to trump individual rights to equality and property. However, the court struck down the clause that barred judicial review, birthing the famous basic structure doctrine. Defiant, Parliament launched its ultimate counter-strike via the 42nd Amendment of 1976, vastly expanding Article 31C to decree that any law passed to implement any directive principle in Part IV could never be declared unconstitutional for violating fundamental rights. This radical move attempted to establish the absolute supremacy of collective welfare, giving the state unchecked power to dismantle individual liberties in the name of social reform, setting the stage for a final showdown over the bedrock of Indian democracy. The definitive resolution to this intense constitutional friction came in the historic 1980 Minerva Mills case, where the Supreme Court firmly struck down Parliament's aggressive overreach. The court ruled that Parliament's power to amend the constitution is inherently limited and cannot be used to destroy individual freedoms, with Chief Justice Y. V. Chandrachud delivering the immortal dictum, "To destroy the fundamental rights to achieve the goals of the directive principles is to destroy the foundation to build the roof." Today, this landmark ruling anchors our standing legal position in a state of perfect equilibrium. While fundamental rights generally maintain formal supremacy, an ironclad exception remains where laws genuinely enacted to fulfill the core socialist directives of Article 39B and Article 39C are fully protected and maintain supremacy over individual challenges under Articles 14 and 19. This intense legal evolution ultimately birthed the definitive synthesis of the Indian constitutional framework, the modern Doctrine of Harmonious Construction, which states that Part 3 and Part IV are not bitter adversaries, but rather complementary halves of the exact same social contract. As the landmark Minerva Mills dictum beautifully observed, the Indian constitution is founded on a bedrock of balance, functioning like the two wheels of a single chariot where prioritizing one over the other causes the entire architecture of the state to collapse. The structural truth remains that individual liberty without social welfare leads to raw exploitation, while social welfare without individual liberty leads directly to tyranny, meaning both wheels must move in perfect harmony for the nation to advance. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of this constitutional blueprint lies in its dual commitment to both the individual and the community. Even as non-justiciable guides, the directive principles remain the unshakable moral and constitutional compass for all legislative action in India. Through their profound threefold vision, socialist, Gandhian, and liberal intellectual, they structurally compel the state to dismantle inequality, empower the grassroots, and continuously modernize the nation. Decades of intense legal friction have yielded the vital doctrine of harmonious construction, proving once and for all that a true welfare state cannot exist through a forced choice between freedom and bread. Instead, it requires the inseparable marriage of individual liberty and collective justice, ensuring that both wheels of the constitutional chariot move forward in perfect harmony. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment if you enjoyed this quick revision.